Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. Excited today to sit down and have a different conversation, one that we haven't had before. Our guest is Nina Jean Lewis, who is a structural engineer, and she's really passionate about bringing together different communities with this engineering conversation, cultural heritage, climate science, to design culturally sensitive strategies for communities, and bringing lots of different partners and stakeholders into that conversation. So we're excited to have that conversation about engineering. We've never really approached it from this perspective. But before we do that, we love to get to know the people that we're talking to. So if you could tell us a little bit, Nina, about your background, how you got involved in engineering, and then we can we'll move into the brand of engineering that you're really passionate about and the work that you're doing right now. But talk to us about how you got involved in this and why the interest in historic places when it comes to engineering as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I think you led just with it just correct. Yes, I'm a structural engineer. And the way I got into engineering was through my father. My father is also an engineer. I originally wanted to do either archaeology or architecture, but my father was like, I think you should do engineering. But I always wanted to figure out a way to incorporate my love of archaeology. As a kid, I was always into National Geographic magazines, and I created my own little reality, my own little National Geographic world in my garden at my parents' home when I was a kid. And I was so fascinated about learning what the world looks like, what other cultures exist, how actually similar these cultures may be or how different they may be. But we have this string of humankind that ties us all together. And so I always had this inclination of discovery and exploration, of wanting to understand how civilizations are created, what essentially showcases that civilization from an identity perspective. And when I became an engineer, one of the reasons why I also loved becoming an engineer was because I was designing things for people, buildings for people. But there was always a disconnect. There was always a disconnect I felt with engineering, that I always loved history. I've always loved science. And mathematics wasn't really my strongest suit. A lot of people are like, oh, you're an engineer, you must be good at math. I was, but I wasn't the best. And I had just more of this inclination of how to incorporate people's histories in our solutions. So when I was able to kind of recollect as a child, being from New York, I was born in Flushing, Queens. I grew up in both between New York and South Florida. My parents moved to South Florida, like most New Yorkers, when I was a baby. And I grew up between South Florida, Broward County, and then also New York. But as a kid, every time we went to see family in New York, especially in the Greenwich Village area of New York, I would get fascinated about these brownstones that were of different, like, Federalist period, and then you have some Georgian type of actual row homes, and I would just get lost in them to the point where my parents were like, "Where is Nina?" And they'll be in Washington Park, and they would find me at a cast iron gate overlooking this person's home, and just wondering what were the stories that took place in that house, because these were homes and styles that were not common in South Florida. So I felt like my inclination for learning about stories, learning about people, learning about what creates their culture happened at a very young age. And so I tried to really incorporate that in my master's, because I was like, there was something missing. I wanted that cultural heritage component. And that's when I decided to do my master's in historic preservation at Pratt Institute in New York. Kind of came around full circle. It was like I was returning back to my childhood at that point. And that's when I started to delve in the area of engineering that was specific to historic construction, cultural heritage, and I started to get more of the story. However, I still felt a gap. I still felt that where's the people in this? Where's the community in this? And where's their voice in our decisions when we're saying readaptively reusing the space? And that's when I decided, after kind of being in and out of industry, I decided to do my PhD within the engineering department here at University of Miami, but with the emphasis of how can we create code-driven community solutions for climate change safeguarding and protection of cultural landscapes and heritage, to have the community be at the forefront of that.
So it's fascinating because a lot of engineering work that, we get involved in, or that most preservationists get involved in, is sort of like straightforward. It's like building's collapsing. What do we need to do to keep the building standing? Engineer comes in, and at the risk of being cruel, they're normally very straightforward. They're very dry and calculating. Yes. They're like, this is what you need to do. This is it. They write up the little thing and then they're out. Like, there's not a whole lot of, oh, this sounds mean, but there's not a whole lot of humanity to it. It's very calculated. It's very hard science. And that's a sort of like, I think, what we've come to expect for a lot of us working in the built environment, for like what that experience is like. How should, in your mind, how should it work, and what would be like the best case scenario for that kind of interaction? What are you hoping to achieve when you talk about this sort of humanity driven version of engineering?
Yeah, I say a lot of times, make engineering human again, because at the forefront of any type of engineering, you are trying to design a solution to a person's problem, right? So it always began with people and understanding people's interaction with the world around them, and how we can make that interaction more seamless, or make that interaction more comfortable. And so I understand what you're saying, because oftentimes, and I think preservation was the way that showed me that this can be done a little differently, where when working in this space with other preservation engineers, these are the structural engineers that specifically work in historic preservation. They have, at least from my experience from working in New York, in the DC metro area, that you have actually a closer relationship with your client. And it's a little more this engineer-client relationship. A lot of the time, that's also with the architect too, that you have this closer relationship and understanding the issues that your client may be facing, and trying to look at it that you can't just maybe put a certain column somewhere just because it needs that support. You're having to understand now, this is a historic building that has a story, that had a use. Now that use is changing. And I specifically talk about adaptive reuse because this is where you start to see kind of this humanization again, because there's a client that's saying, okay, I loved how this was maybe a house for a family, but we want to turn this into a house museum to show this history to the rest of the world. But we now have a different occupancy, and we need to now maybe consider a little bit the existing construction. How do we go about doing that? And so it creates that space for dialogue. But when we're taking it a step further, right? When we're taking and we're discussing more, what are some natural disasters that are going to impact this house or impact this site? You have to engage with the community to understand how they're currently dealing with those challenges, especially if you're working in communities that are maybe indigenous or that have been living in rural spaces and they themselves are the only people that know how to interact with those natural disasters. You have to speak to them and to know how over time they were able to combat some of these things and maybe think about how to incorporate that in our solutions. So it really becomes when you start thinking more future based scenarios for your site, it generates this space for this collaboration to happen. But to your point, yeah, I mean, engineers, unfortunately, we're kind of at the end of the design process, right? We may come in at, say, a design development phase where an architect has already worked with a client and has come up with design, and we come in there and be like, okay, this is structurally how you make the design plausible. We're more hands-on in the construction phase, but that's why for me it was the community part was still missing even in my space of preservation, because I still felt that the actual design process of engineering and architecture and industry was still not really fully allowing for that space unless you were maybe working in a smaller firm or you're working in a nonprofit organization that had that communication. You see it more in preservation versus, say, a larger big box Fortune 500 company where you're only maybe working on how to structurally stabilize a door. You get what I'm saying? So when you start thinking of future scenarios and the what ifs and starting to future plan for that site, that's when I start to see the conversation change.
So it's interesting. There's a couple threads there. One, which is unique, is that it seems like the larger industry has something to learn from preservation, which oftentimes we always are. I feel like we're very self critical, where it's like preservation needs to learn from the larger industry. How come we can't do things like the industry does? But in this case, it's almost like the industry can learn a little bit about that human centered approach. I'm also curious. I want to pick up on if you could give us an example for someone listening of when you say a community, whether it's indigenous or just a long-standing community that has been dealing with resiliency, whether it be flooding or tornadoes or any type of disaster, that they're making their space more resilient, and that's something that engineers should be looking to for solutions to future challenges. Can you give us a good example of that where you've seen that in practice?
Absolutely. So actually, I just wrapped up an incredible summer program at the Polytechnico di Torino called Resiliage. And they are exactly doing this work. And one of the case studies we were working on specifically, where we're starting to see and I will say this like this. I'm talking more about the awareness because actually that's where we need to start before we go into the actual solution. It's about building the awareness that can then lead to the solution. And what we were working on is this case study in Turkey specifically where heat waves are not considered a hazard. Here in Miami, we actually nationally recognize it as a hazard. We have even a resilience officer, heat officer that is designated to do that work and oversee it. But in other countries and other areas of the world, heat waves are not considered a hazard on par, say, with earthquakes or flooding. But something that was the challenge identified by the community is how do we make heat waves not only recognized as a hazard, but then start to think about the solutions of maybe perhaps modifying some of our buildings. And you just can't put more air conditioning units in buildings. That's not that is not a long-term fix. And something that we worked on is like, well, this is a region where there's so many different converging cultures. You have also in this region mountainous cultures and coastal cultures. Why don't we start with oral histories and understanding how each culture, how each area has experienced these heat waves from, say, when, and this is a more elderly population that we were focusing on, and understanding maybe how the heat wave has changed over time, how has it impacted their behaviors, and so kind of approaching first qualitatively. and being able to pull these oral histories. And this was just mainly a project idea. It hasn't been deployed, but we eventually, what we did, we created a game out of it, like a journey game that K through 12 individual can play with their grandparents and kind of go on this journey throughout the region to essentially be taking some of these oral traditions from, say, a fisherman or an agricultural worker or, say a pregnant woman in the coastal city and how that affects them. So you're not only learning about these oral histories and how they are, perhaps how they've combated the heat waves before, but also how they're thinking about combating it today. Those solutions, now, when you're thinking from a structural engineering standpoint, for example, can maybe where we're introducing more green spaces, right? Because that's how they've dealt with it before. They had more shade, they had more plants, they had more gardens to cool down the area. That's what's missing in the area. So, an engineered solution would be introducing, along with planning, introducing more green spaces and maybe thinking about sustainability in the sense like perhaps we can create green roofs and more biodiverse design in these existing buildings. Also, it could be thinking about the materials, right, that you're using and to maybe retrofit these buildings. What are some of the materials that you can use that are temperature regulators? And that you're starting to learn from the community because of these oral histories. So that is, I would say, a very clear example where you're actually starting, instead of just first saying, okay, let's go jump into the solution, you're first creating kind of this built awareness of this is how this hazard is impacting these people from different converging cultures. This is how they have dealt with it over time. This is the changes. And those are some of the nuggets that you can utilize for more resilient strategies like I gave.
Well, first off, I want to play the board game. That sounds like fun. That
Yes.
sounds really, really cool. You gotta release that so people can see that and adapt it for their own communities. And then the other thing I was going to say is, as someone who's not an engineer, but interacts with this world, at the risk of oversimplifying it, it sounds also like you're talking about trying to find sort of indigenous or existing passive technologies that work really well, right? Like I
Correct.
feel like a lot of engineering of the 20th century, 19th and 20th century was sort of like, how do we force and adapt nature to exist in the way that we want to? And we'll just climate control everything and we'll hold the floodwaters back and we'll do all these things. And now we're realizing like, oh, passive flood control, letting the water come into buildings and then leave sometimes is better. Or, figuring out ways to cool a building without requiring just endless amounts of energy. Like,
Correct.
I oftentimes even look at, like buildings that we inhabit where we're like, if this was the 19th century and there wasn't air conditioning, this building would be completely inhospitable. Like you
Mm-hmm.
couldn't live in a building like this. But in the 19th century, they did live in buildings. There were heat waves and they had porches and they oriented them correctly and they used green technology, which they didn't call green technology. They just called it planting a tree. But like things
Yes.
like that, it's almost like it's like engineering is having sort of a, having to sort of confront the reality of the world that we live in, that we can't build and engineer our way out of every solution. Is
Correct.
that, are you just sort of, is your lens through this, okay, we're going to talk with communities to figure out this and to convince engineers to do what they need to be doing? Is that kind of, I don't want to oversimplify it, but
No,
it
I
seems
understand.
like that's kind of where this is. And it seems really powerful. It seems important for the engineering community to be hearing this.
Yeah, I think as engineers, we have really an amazing capacity to problem solve. And we've created such amazing infrastructure solutions and building technology solutions to combat a lot of what we're seeing. But we're getting to a point now where the knowledge that is needed to really learn more on how humans have coexisted with some of these changes is requiring more methods than just engineering. It's requiring this bridging of, say, anthropology and through a relational values lens of understanding how people have interacted with their natural environment. And this is something that we used to do often as engineers. We started here, but as technology increased, the production increased, our industry went a different direction in terms of, I mean, like most industries becoming very profit heavy. Our industry currently, the industry of engineering, architecture, and construction, you can even see it in our schedules, does not provide the space for community interaction, because the thing about community interaction and knowledge building, it requires this capacity of time and to build trust and rapport. And that's not built in our typical design build schedules, right? Preservation does offer this resource a bit, because you're not just building a new building, you're having to figure out with this existing building that has existed 200 years, one, how has it existed for 200 years and is still standing, and the people's relationship to that building and to the environment around it. So this is what my research really, really focuses on, is bringing relational values back into the conversation. How we as human beings throughout time, regardless of what cultural background you come from, learning from that background and understanding how each of these cultures have over time adapted. And that's such it's traditional knowledge. It's also called traditional ecological knowledge, tech, ancestral knowledge that used to inform that, the way that, say, for example, sometimes how masonry was laid in the 19th century, that came from knowledge, built knowledge over time. But somewhere in the 60s and 70s, as we started post-war construction, as we started this rapid building everywhere, this rapid development, we kind of lost that sight. We lost that sight of that. And so that's what I'm advocating, is that we need to somehow think about building this back in our schedules, especially if you're working with a client in a community that is very focused on, okay, this site has maybe lasted 200 years. We have, say, more increase in testify hurricanes coming in the area. How do we make it last another 200 years through that? You have to sit with the community, take their stories, and yeah, some engineers don't want to do that. And I get that. Some engineers are comfortable with their formulas. And I just wasn't an engineer that was like that. I was an engineer that always sought to understand the client, sought to understand the impact our solutions may have. And this is why I'm so excited to see our university and our department to really champion these nature-based solutions, reintroducing. We have a huge project that's going on called Sea Hive, and that is creating these concrete structures, hexagonal structures that can be installed as like breakwaters there when you have a hurricane and storm surge come in, they break up the water, but it's also a habitat for coral and other ecosystems, and tying that in with maybe building mangroves in a certain area. And it's a project right now that we have deployed in Miami and in, I believe, Wahoo Bay and Pompano. And so some of these nature-based solutions have required being the community, having the community involved and saying, okay, this is something that we're thinking about. This is something we're putting in the natural environment. Will it change how you react with the environment? And having those community conversations and bringing the ecosystem back into the equation. But you don't know how to do that unless you talk with the people who know that knowledge.
Right. It's interesting because in some ways it's a couple different thoughts here. One is that it's sort of like this Jane Jacobs moment for engineering that architecture and planning had in the 60s, and sort of thinking about, well, maybe we can't, maybe not everything new and over centralized planning works. Maybe sometimes we should talk to people in the communities about what they want first too, and make things livable and human scaled. The other thought here too is that I feel like, and I'm curious what you think about this, it seems like a lot of the hard sciences are confronting this, that as, and I recently heard a sort of report and thought about this conversation about how doctors are having to take classes on how to have bedside manner, basically. And they're doing all sorts of things like, taking different, classes on basically just how to communicate with people, because we're really good at teaching doctors how to be doctors, but there's not a lot of time or effort put into making them people that can communicate that information. And it's sort of the same with engineering. And I imagine with the increase in AI, like the formulas, that work is becoming more and more something that, yes, we can do that, but how do we convey that? And so in some ways, is this sort of like the triumph of humanities, in that the humanities now are coming back to teach the hard science something? Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, I think we're at a pivotal moment that when we're trying to solve kind of these, I hate to put it in this way, but these existential crises that are coming our way in terms of certain both climate and anthropogenic impacts, because those two tie with each other. If you are developing an area consistently, and you're damaging the ecosystem that is meant to defend the area, like you're now exacerbating some climate impacts, right? So when we're faced with these bit of existential crises, like I'm glad to finally see that especially our department really open their doors to understand, okay, as engineers, we may have not delved in the space of community engagement, community outreach, community advocacy. Maybe we can rely on the social science such as anthropology to really help us and help to us together to create methodologies that are more impactful, not so extractive. And so it is this, yeah, I would say you said it perfectly, this Jane Jacob moment for engineering. And the way that I'm seeing this start to be included is also I taught a course in the innovation design program in the College of Engineering, that I taught a semester of basically how do you insert empathy into your design solutions. And it was strange because they're like, you're an engineer teaching empathy. And I said, well, emotional intelligence is really important here too when you're working with communities. And I pulled a lot of different toolbox moments from anthropology, because anthropology is the science. It's not a perfect science. No science is perfect, but it is the study of people, and especially ethnography. When you're talking about cultural phenomena, ethnography is that field that has the tools to know how to engage with the community. And so empathy was a big part of what I was talking about with my students, and how to insert that empathy in community driven work. Some of my students were working with for-profit clients. Some other students were also working with community nonprofit clients. So you even had different user profiles. But understanding, one of the things I taught them was etic versus emic definition. I speak about this a lot, where etic is essentially, the best way I can describe it is the definition maybe us researchers, us academics, us experts may have. So for example, I may have an idea of climate resilience in a particular area, and I may be defining resilience as the, simply put, as a system bouncing back or rearranging itself to a particular challenge. EMIC definition is when you start getting involved in community work, you start talking with them, you start doing interviews. Emically, the community may define resilience very differently, and they may not even be focused on resilience. They may be focused more on vulnerability, wanting to know what hazard is impacting some of their culturally sacred sites, right? And so we may have that idea of going in resilience, we're going to build resilience for this community. But you have to hold these definitions loosely, because at the end of the day, the community is going to have a definition. And what's interesting is seeing how these etic and emic definitions, how aligned they are or how very different they are. And I teach that concept because I always say we may have a defined problem of how we want to maybe work with a community, but ultimately, when you're working with the community, that definition of the problem is going to evolve, and you have to evolve with it.
Yeah. It's interesting. This is a conversation about engineering, but really there's applications for every aspect of
Yes.
preservation in particular, which is the lens that we look at things through on PreserveCast, which is, this whole idea of empathy and preservation. I've certainly thought about it, but I've never heard anyone put it that way. And so I feel like we need to put a pin in that and come back to that at some point in the future to talk about
Absolutely. I would love to talk
empathy.
about that.
Yeah, let's do a whole episode on empathy. So, where does this all take you? Where are you headed with this? What's because we could go on and on and on, but we don't have time to do that today. But like, where are you headed with this? So, you're going to publish a dissertation. You're going to publish a book. You're going to teach. What are you
Yes.
going to What are you going to do with all this?
Yeah, I mean, eventually, why I'm doing this research is I want to create a methodology that anybody in the hard sciences can utilize to approach their cultural landscapes or even a cultural site. It could be applicable to how they want to approach it, but show them how maybe we don't have to be ethnographers, but how maybe some tools of ethnography can be utilized with more of the quantitative tools of engineering to more holistically assess resilience for cultural landscapes in particular. And I focused on cultural landscapes because it's actually a very difficult thing to focus on because you're not only focusing on tangible heritage and natural heritage, but you're really also focusing on the intangible relationships that emerge out of that. And we don't talk enough about how is intangible heritage being protected from, or not only protected, but maybe how is this heritage a resource in understanding how communities can be disaster resilient? That's something, a bit of a mindset change I've was able to walk through this summer in this summer school is instead of always focusing on protecting heritage, what if we looked at heritage as a resource, right? And so this is the methodology, not only, of course, I'm going to publish, but um, I want to be able to teach and teach on more of that global platform where I want to see how this is being done in the EU, how is it being done in Latin America, and how is it being done in the Asian Pacific countries, and being able to see how we can collectively collaborate and not work on our silos anymore. Because I think what's a challenge with all this, we have so many different plans, so many different methodologies that all just sit on a shelf. So how can we not replicate the cycle and be able to disseminate this information? So for me, teaching is as a love of mine, and I will continue to teach. So I definitely am going to have that as a path, but also I do plan to write. You know how critical theory is applied in a lot of different aspects of preservation. Well, I kind of want to discuss a little bit critical engineering and how to put a critical lens on engineering and what can we do to humanize it again. So I do have a book plan in the future, but till I'm done with the dissertation, I can't even entertain on right now.
Well, we'll definitely have you back throughout the process. It'd be great to keep this conversation going. Before we go, we got a couple sort of questions that we ask folks. I mean, we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of this country's founding. With the Declaration of Independence, at least. And we're curious what people think. What do they hope to see come out of that for the preservation community, or in your case, for the community that you represent?
So yes, I mean, for me, and I would caveat this that a lot of my focus of my work is in minority heritage, and bringing awareness to minority heritage. So I mean, I'll be coming from that lens where, for America's 250th anniversary, I want to see from the preservation community the celebration of all the different heritage groups that created this nation, and focus on how all these heritage groups came together, integrated to create this country that we have today, and shed a light on a lot of what is now considered minority heritage. So for me, that is something to discuss and talk about.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And we're definitely trying to do that here and elevate different stories. Um,
Absolutely.
so also before we go, we always ask people, do they have a favorite historic place or site?
Yes. I thought about this a little bit because I've heard this on your podcast before, so I knew it was coming. And for me, this one's a challenge because I really enjoy sites that have hidden histories, right? Histories that are not known to a lot of people, or histories that may be a little convoluted. And but one site that I have has a combination of family history and also hidden history. And I have to say, I mean, Washington Square Park in New York It's where my parents met. It's where they had their first date. It's where I got lost and found my first historic site. Like, so there's a lot of special relationship to Washington Square Park, but a lot of people don't know that Washington Square Park used to be a potter's field. And people are walking by thinking it's, oh, this beautifully made park. I'm like, no, it actually was a potter's field for a lot of the indentured servitude in the area. And that's something to be recognized and kind of reconciled. So that's why I say I enjoy going to sites that have these hidden histories, but sometimes these hidden histories aren't reconciled. And so those often for me take the place because it's history that people should know about and learn about. And, hopefully through that learning, it could be reconciled.
Yeah, no, that's a great place to leave the conversation, and a great location for us to put someday. I keep threatening that we're going to put together a map of all the places that are people's favorite historic places and sites. I think it would be very cool to see
That would be great.
what sort of trends pop up. So yeah, we need to do that at some point. We'll definitely put a link in the show notes to your website, which is great, and connect people. So if they want to get in touch with you, or they're an engineer and they're interested in this concept, or they're working in academia and they want to connect, we'll have that in there. But it's been such a pleasure sitting down with you, Nina. Thank you again for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.